Welcome back. This is your corruption scorecard here on eNCA. We are now joined, in addition to the other panelists we've had all along, joined by the former Auditor General of South Africa, Shauket Fakie, who joins us via Skype as well. Thank you so much for joining us. Let me just bring you in right away, Shauket Fakie, and ask you that, you know, every time your successor reports about irregular, fruitless, expenditure, unauthorized expenditure, and always lamenting how it keeps growing and growing, I shake my head because, I'm old enough to remember a time when you used to do that, and the issues were exactly the same. How do you feel? Do you feel despondent at all, seeing that there's been absolutely no progress in terms of taking responsibility and accounting for public monies?
Yeah, thanks for putting the question forward, and thank you to your listeners as well. It is discouraging and disturbing to note that the same issues get reported year in and year out, and in fact, the situation gets worse and worse. In other words, that number of unauthorized expenditure keeps growing on a year-by-year basis, and it is very discouraging to note that really nothing, very little gets done around it. I also want to comment that, we've been instrumental in putting together a very good piece of act, which is the Public Finance Management Act, which was very progressive in its thinking when the act was put together, in the sense that it said, let managers manage, but we hold them accountable. And what's happened, the rope has been loosened a little bit by allowing managers to manage, which is the right thing to do. But the second part of that whole equation has fallen away because we're not holding people accountable.
All right, I'll come back in a moment to you, Mr. Fakie, and ask you specifically about this whole notion that irregular expenditure does not always amount to corruption. But I'll ask you about that in a moment. Let me bring in Crispian Oliver back into the conversation. Paint for me, Crispian, the matrix between political players at local level, at branch level, and those who hold office in the state, including their relatives. Because what has struck me, Crispian Oliver, is, there's explanations that sort of portray a picture of people who perhaps simply just don't get this whole concept of conflict of interest. I'm not the one doing business with the state. So what if my son, if I'm, Ace Machashule, so what if my son happens to get contracts? And Matsigane Diko also proffering the same explanation that, my wife is not the one doing business with the state. I'm the one who tendered. So what's the problem there?
So, this takes us into the way that political parties are structured in relation to municipalities. And I can speak with some knowledge of how the ANC operates, because I have been involved in the ANC and I remain active. So you've got regional ANC structures and regional offices that have taken it upon themselves to issue instructions directly into the municipality in order to get things done. And the original motivation was that this was about asserting strategic control over the municipality. But what happens in that process is that, first of all, lines of accountability get blurred. So, you appoint a mayor, the mayor's meant to run the municipality, but you've now got the regional office actually purporting to run it. And then these regional officers get involved in areas that they've got no business discussing or even having an opinion on. And that's around appointments and around procurement. And then all hell breaks loose, because once the regional office is making decisions about procurement, that is going to be about how the party benefits and about how individuals associated with the key leaders advance themselves in the process.
All right.
So very quickly you get a situation. Sorry.
Yeah, sorry, we're sort of running out of time. Mr. Godi, let me ask you about the letter that President Cyril Ramaphosa, in his capacity as the ANC president, has written to his comrades. He says, let this be a turning point in our fight against corruption. Let's not discuss, because of time, let's not discuss the politics of it, but go straight to some of the solutions that he suggests, which do include implementing resolutions that they agreed to some 3 years ago already, but then adding some of his own ideas, for instance, around this whole idea of a whole of society response and the open tender system being advanced. Would that work?
Yeah, well, look, Thulas, the issue is always implementation. Because like you said earlier, legislation is there, regulations are there, very clear. But the problem and the challenge has always been implementation and the factionalization of corruption within the ANC. I think Kwame Nkrumah said it well, that the best way to fight against corruption is to raise public indignation.
Yeah.
I think that is the best hope that we can have.
All right, Mr. Godi, we do seem to have a bit of a challenge with your line. I'm going to release you and thank you for your participation, but ask you to stay there for a moment as I bring in Shauket Fakie back into the conversation. Let me ask you, former AG of the Republic, you know, every time there's reports of irregular, fruitless, wasteful expenditure, the quick counter is that you guys assume that, you know, that was corruption. It's not always corruption. Sometimes, you know, there was no time to follow the prescripts of the PFMA, and then this was then ratified later by the accounting officers as well as the legislature wherever necessary. I argue that, you know, pardon my language, that's BS. I mean, that for me opens a flank for corruption, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, if you're living in a real world, there's always a need to sometimes deviate from your rules, regulations, policies, and procedures, but that should happen by exception. And if you do proper planning of your work plan, then you shouldn't be faced with a situation where you get caught with an emergency procurement or an emergency that you need to deal with, and therefore you're unable to follow a proper due process from policy procedure point of view. And that often results in the Auditor General reporting what we call unauthorized irregular expenditure. And as you rightfully pointed out, Thulani, that this doesn't necessarily mean in every case that there is fraud or corruption. It just means that a process hasn't been followed. But when that becomes a norm, in other words, there are far too many situations and cases where people have to bypass policies, procedures, it opens up the floodgate. You're absolutely right.
All right, thank you to all of you for taking part in this conversation. Unfortunately, we had a bit of a challenge with the technology doing all of this remotely these days, and it did cost us a bit of time, but I do appreciate your time. Crispian Oliver there, and former Auditor General Shauket Fakie, as well as Themba Godi, who joined for this conversation a bit earlier on, and Corruption Watch's Karam Singh. Well, I'd like the team to cue the music, please. This segment needs that music.